past, an age of chivalry and castles, of kings and queens ruling vast realms from atop bejeweled thrones. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight and what time of day it is in your corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and share. It's always a delight to see the diversity of this sleepy, history-loving community. And if you enjoy these relaxing forays into yesteryear, consider subscribing so you never have trouble sleeping or relaxing again. Now make yourself comfortable, dear friend. Perhaps you're nestled beneath soft sheets or curled up on a cozy sofa. As your eyelids grow heavy and your breath slows, let my words carry you gently back through the centuries to an era both familiar and strange, where we'll peek behind the stone walls of great castles and into the lives of those who once dwelled within. Tonight, we travel to medieval Europe, spanning from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the Renaissance blossoming of the 15th. It was a time of faith and superstition, of plagues and progress, of conquests and crusades. Looming large over this ever-shifting landscape were the monarchs, those princes and princesses, kings and queens who claimed divine right to rule by the grace of God. From bejeweled crowns to ermine-trimmed cloaks, the royal regalia of the Middle Ages still captures our modern imaginations. When we picture the rulers of old, it's all too easy to envision them in a haze of unimaginable opulence, forever feasting and dancing, hunting and hawking, waging war and welcoming peace, draped in silks and dripping in jewels. But what was life really like for the royals of medieval Europe? How did they while away their days within the walls of sprawling castles and fortified manors? When they laid their crowned heads down to rest each night, what dreams and nightmares flickered behind their noble brows? As your own head sinks heavily into your pillow, I invite you to put yourself in their embroidered slippers for a spell. Imagine that you're a king or queen in the Middle Ages, born to a life of unimaginable privilege and power, but also one bound by duty, expectation, and tradition. Each choice you make will shape not just your own destiny, but the fate of kingdoms. So join me now, dear listener, as we tiptoe through echoing throne rooms and down torch-lit passageways, our footfalls softened by thick rushes strewn across cold stone. We'll eavesdrop on councils and ceremonies, feasts and festivals, births and betrothals. In the process, we may just discover that the royals of old were more human than the dusty pages of history might suggest. Our first stop will be the royal bedchamber itself, that most private of sanctums, where monarchs began and ended each day. As you nestle deeper into your own downy cocoon, let us draw back the heavy velvet drapes and greet the dawn as they might have, many centuries ago. Imagine, if you will, the first rays of sunlight creeping through an arrow-slit window, glinting off the gold threads of a finely wrought tapestry. A gently smouldering hearth lends the chamber a drowsy warmth, its flickering light dancing across the intricate carvings of a massive oak bed piled high with embroidered pillows and luxuriant furs. All is still, save for the measured breathing of the noble sleepers within. Before long, a gentle rapping at the door rouses the royal pair. It's the groom of the stool, that most intimate of courtiers, arriving to help the king with his morning ablutions. With great ceremony, the monarch is washed, dried, and dressed, layer upon sumptuous layer. The queen is tended to by her ladies-in-waiting, each one a high-born beauty vying for her favour. Devotions come next, as the king and queen are expected to set a pious example for their subjects. In a small private chapel, they kneel side by side to recite the morning offices, the Latin phrases well worn upon their tongues. The haze of incense and the glimmer of chalices induce an almost dreamlike state, a reminder that the right to rule is a divine mandate, and even the mightiest must humble themselves before God. But for all the ceremony, pomp, and prayer, Medieval monarchs also had more worldly matters to attend to, and so, fortified by their faith, the king and queen emerged to face a day packed with courtly duties and obligations. As we've seen, despite their immense power and privilege, medieval monarchs were still very much human, with all the follies, fears, and foibles that entails. Their lives were defined as much by weighty duties as frivolous entertainments, as much by piety as politics. And perhaps no ruler better embodied these contradictions than the 12th century Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in 1122 to one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in France, the young Eleanor was the heiress to a vast domain that comprised nearly a third of the country. Beautiful, intelligent, and strong-willed, she was one of the most eligible bachelorettes in Europe. In 1137, at the tender age of 15, she wed the 17-year-old Prince Louis, heir to the French throne. It was a prestigious match, but not a happy one. The scholarly, pious Louis was ill-suited to the vivacious and worldly Eleanor. Nevertheless, when Louis's father died later that year, the teenage couple became King Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of France. Despite their differences, Eleanor joined Louis on the Second Crusade in 1147, leading a contingent of her own Aquitanian soldiers. This headstrong act was rather scandalous at the time. Crusading was thought to be the domain of men, not ladies, but Eleanor was no ordinary lady. Dressed in armor and mounted on a white horse, she cut a striking figure on the march to the Holy Land. Unfortunately, like most crusades, it ended in disappointment. The Christian armies failed to retake Jerusalem and returned home in defeat. The crusade only widened the rift between Eleanor and Louis. They had never been close, but now they could barely stand each other. After 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters, the mismatched couple sought an annulment on grounds of consanguinity, being related by blood, a big taboo for the church. In reality, it was a thin excuse to get out of an unhappy marriage. The Pope granted the annulment in 1152, and at the age of 30, Eleanor found herself single and ready to mingle. She didn't stay single for long though. Just 2 months after her annulment, Eleanor married the strapping young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, an 18-year-old fellow by the name of Henry Plantagenet. It was a whirlwind romance and a savvy political move. Through their union, Eleanor's lands were joined with Henry's, creating a powerful counterweight to the French crown. But that was just the beginning. When Henry's cousin King Stephen of England died in 1154, Henry pressed his claim to the English throne and became King Henry II, with Eleanor as his queen. At a stroke, the couple now ruled a vast empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, the so-called Angevin Empire. Over the next 13 years, the fertile Eleanor would bear Henry 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland of Magna Carta fame. However, all was not wedded bliss for the royal couple. Like Eleanor's first marriage, her second union was marked by conflict and strife. Henry was a serial philanderer, openly taking mistresses and siring illegitimate children. He was also a domineering and often cruel husband, restricting Eleanor's movements and limiting her authority. The fiercely independent Eleanor chafed at such treatment, and the marriage deteriorated into a Cold War. Things came to a head in 1173 when Eleanor's sons, prodded by their mother, rebelled against Henry in a bid for power. It was the ultimate dynastic betrayal. But the revolt sputtered out and Henry took his revenge. He captured Eleanor and imprisoned her for the next 16 years, locking her away in various royal castles. Her sons fared little better. Henry's namesake, the young king, died of dysentery while leading a rebellion in 1183. Geoffrey perished in a jousting tournament in 1186. But time and tide wait for no man, not even kings. When Henry himself died in 1189, Eleanor's favourite son Richard ascended to the throne, and one of his first acts was to free his long-suffering mother. At the ripe old age of 67, Eleanor rode out of captivity and returned to the seat of power. With Richard often absent on crusade, Eleanor served as regent for her son, skillfully managing the realm and his ransom when he was briefly held hostage. Even in her twilight years, the indomitable Eleanor remained a force to be reckoned with. When Richard died in 1199, she supported her youngest son John's claim to the crown over his nephew Arthur. At the age of 77, she personally led an army to lay siege to Arthur's supporters, securing the succession for John. She died in 1204 at the monastery of Fontevraud, at the astounding age of 82, an incredible lifespan for that time. In many ways, Eleanor of Aquitaine both reflected and defied the norms for medieval queens. She wielded immense power and wealth, shaping the politics of her age through her marriages and machinations. But she also endured great hardships, from an abusive husband to a 16-year imprisonment. She was a woman who broke the mold, who refused to be constrained by the expectations of her gender or station. A trendsetter and a trailblazer, a crusader and a queen, a mother and a monarch. Eleanor's extraordinary life reads like something out of an epic novel. Yet her story is no fiction, but rather a testament to the complex realities of life for medieval royalty. The power and the privilege, the duty and the domesticity, the piety and the politics, all were part and parcel of the royal experience. Eleanor embodied these contradictions perhaps more than any other, navigating them with savvy and tenacity. Her legacy continues to loom large, captivating the imagination of historians and novelists alike. As we explore the lives of other notable rulers like Eleanor, a rich tapestry of medieval monarchy emerges. A world of decadent feasts and pious fasts, of grand castles and grander cathedrals, of arranged marriages and courtly love affairs. A world where reputation was everything and dynasty was destiny, where the crown was both a blessing and a burden. In short, a world at once strangely alien and strikingly familiar. Perhaps that is why peering into the private lives of medieval kings and queens continues to fascinate us. It offers a window into a lost world, a glimpse of humanity beneath the crowns and coronets. In their triumphs and tribulations, their vices and virtues, we see reflections of ourselves across the ages. And in that sense, their stories become our stories, their history becomes our heritage. So as we conclude our journey through the rarefied realm of medieval royalty, let us take a moment to ponder the lessons their lives can teach us. The perils of power, the burdens of privilege, the weight of expectation, but also the enduring human capacity for resilience, for reinvention, for leaving a mark on history. For in the end, though they may have worn crowns and sat on thrones, they were still flesh and blood, still fallible and mortal, just like you and me. And on that note, dear listener, it is time for us to bid farewell to the gilded courts and candlelit halls of ages past. May your dreams be filled with visions of mighty castles and fair maidens, of brave knights and wise kings. And may you awake refreshed with a newfound appreciation for the royalty of old and the humanity in us all. Until next time, I bid thee good night and sweet dreams. With the founding of the Order of the Garter, Edward III set a new standard for the pageantry and chivalric ideals that would come to define royal life in the late Middle Ages. This prestigious order of knighthood, with its elaborate ceremonies, grand feasts, and distinctive emblem of a blue garter, epitomized the pomp and majesty that medieval monarchs sought to cultivate. As we've seen, Edward and his Queen Philippa presided over a splendid court culture at Windsor Castle, surrounding themselves with the greatest artists, poets, and musicians of the age. But amidst all the grandeur and revelry, medieval rulers were also expected to embody a deep and abiding piety. Religion suffused every aspect of life in the Middle Ages, and this was especially true for monarchs who ruled by divine right. A king or queen was seen as God's anointed representative on earth, entrusted with leading their people, not only in matters of state, but in spiritual affairs as well. As such, medieval royalty were held to the highest standards of moral rectitude and religious devotion. A typical day for a medieval monarch would begin with morning mass in their lavish private chapel, attended by a retinue of priests and clerics. Kings and queens would spend long hours in prayer, offering supplications for the well-being of their realm and the salvation of their immortal soul. The Book of Hours, a richly illuminated devotional text, was a prized possession of many royals who would pore over its gilded pages in quiet contemplation. The religious calendar also dictated much of the rhythm of courtly life. The liturgical year was punctuated by a series of holy feasts and fasts that all members of the royal household were expected to observe. Lent, in particular, saw the royal diet restricted to very simple meatless meals in emulation of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness. But it was during the great celebrations of Christmas and Easter that the piety and majesty of medieval monarchy reached its fullest flower. The king or queen would preside over magnificent ceremonies in the great cathedrals, wearing their finest regalia and crowns. Amid clouds of incense and the chants of massed choirs, they would take communion before their assembled subjects, affirming their role as the ultimate spiritual authority in the land. This public display of piety was immensely important for cultivating the aura of sanctity and righteousness that medieval rulers depended on to legitimate their earthly power. By publicly venerating saintly relics, endowing monasteries and churches, and even embarking on holy pilgrimages and crusades, kings and queens sought to reinforce their image as the godly stewards of Christian society. Perhaps no one embodied this ideal of the pious medieval monarch more fully than Louis IX of France, known to history as Saint Louis. Renowned for his devout faith and austere lifestyle, Louis was a king who fasted regularly, wore a hair shirt under his royal robes as a sign of penance, and even invited the poor to eat at his table. He embarked on 2 ultimately disastrous crusades to the Holy Land, dying of dysentery on the second venture in Tunisia. But his reputation for saintliness only grew, and he was canonized by the Catholic Church just 27 years after his death. Of course, not all medieval rulers lived up to such lofty ideals. For every St. Louis, there was a king like Henry VIII of England, who famously broke with the Catholic Church in order to divorce his first wife, and went on to marry 5 more times. The notorious Pope Alexander VI, who reigned during the Renaissance, openly acknowledged his illegitimate children and was accused of turning the Vatican into a den of depravity. But for most medieval monarchs, piety and prayer remained an essential part of their daily lives and public personas. In an age when the line between the sacred and the secular was thin indeed, kings and queens were expected to bridge that divide, serving as both the temporal and spiritual leaders of their people. It was a weighty responsibility, and one that could take a toll even on the most devout of rulers. The great Carolingian emperor Charlemagne, who ruled much of Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries, was said to have wept with emotion as he took communion on his deathbed. So acutely did he feel the burden of his sins and the immensity of his role as God's vice-regent on earth. For the medieval monarchs who bore this sacred mantle, the glittering trappings of royal life, the sumptuous banquets, the silk-draped beds, the fawning courtiers, were perhaps a welcome distraction from the weighty matters of the soul that occupied so many of their waking hours. In the flickering candlelight of the royal chapel, as the king or queen knelt in prayer before the altar, the outside world, with its earthly cares and pleasures, must have seemed far away indeed. As we contemplate these long-ago rulers in their private moments of piety, we are reminded of the deeply human dimension of even the most exalted lives. Behind the crowns and scepters, The ermine-trimmed robes and the soaring rhetoric, medieval monarchs grappled with the same eternal questions that have always haunted the human heart. Questions of meaning, mortality, and the yearning for connection with the divine. In the tomb-like hush of the great cathedrals where they worshipped, or in the flickering shadows of their own bedchamber, these kings and queens sought solace and guidance from a higher power. And in so doing, they left us a powerful reminder of the enduring search for purpose and transcendence that unites us all across the ages. But even the most pious of rulers could not spend all their days in prayer and contemplation. The business of actually ruling a kingdom called, and medieval monarchs had to navigate a treacherous landscape of competing interests, shifting alliances, and powerful personalities as they sought to maintain their grip on power. Perhaps no one exemplified the shrewd political maneuvering and force of character required of a successful medieval ruler quite like Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into a wealthy noble family in southwestern France in 1122, Eleanor was one of the most eligible bachelorettes in Europe when she inherited the vast duchy of Aquitaine in her own right at the tender age of 15. Her first marriage, to pious King Louis VII of France, was by all accounts a mismatch of personalities. The worldly and cultured Eleanor found the ascetic Louis unbearably dull, and their relationship soured after she accompanied him on the ill-fated Second Crusade to the Holy Land. The expedition was a disaster, and rumours swirled that Eleanor had carried on an affair with her uncle, the dashing Raymond of Poitiers, while encamped in the shadow of the great walls of Antioch. When the royal couple returned to France, their marriage was effectively over, and in a shocking move for the time, the Pope granted Louis an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related. Eleanor, still only 28 years old, suddenly found herself once again the most desirable bride in Christendom. Her next match would prove far more consequential. Just 8 weeks after her annulment, Eleanor married the young Duke of Normandy, who also held vast territories in western France. His name was Henry Plantagenet, and 2 years later he would ascend to the throne of England as King Henry II, with Eleanor as his queen. Together, Eleanor and Henry would preside over a sprawling empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of England and more than half of modern-day France. It was one of the largest and most powerful realms in medieval Europe, and at its centre stood the formidable partnership of Henry and Eleanor. Over the course of their tempestuous 35-year marriage, the royal couple would have 8 children together, including 2 future kings of England, the legendary Richard the Lionheart and his treacherous brother John. Eleanor would serve as regent for her sons when they took the throne, wielding immense power and influence in her own right. But her path to becoming one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe was hardly a smooth one. Eleanor and Henry's marriage was notoriously fractious, marked by infidelities, power struggles, and outright rebellion on the part of their sons, often with Eleanor's backing. In 1173, Eleanor's 3 eldest sons, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, rose up against their father in a bid for greater autonomy and control over their own territories. Eleanor, who had long chafed under Henry's efforts to curtail her authority, sided with her sons in the revolt. But the rebellion was ultimately crushed, and Eleanor was captured while attempting to flee to France. An enraged Henry imprisoned her, keeping his queen under house arrest for the next 16 years. It was only after Henry's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally freed by her son Richard, now King of England. Despite being nearly 70 years old, she lost no time in reasserting her political influence. When Richard set off on the Third Crusade shortly after his coronation, Eleanor served as regent in his absence, governing England with a firm hand. She would go on to outlive both Richard and his successor John, dying in 1204 at the remarkable age of 82. Eleanor's long and tumultuous life offers a fascinating glimpse into the complex realities of power and gender in the medieval world. As a woman who wielded immense influence in her own right, as a wealthy heiress, queen consort, regent, and mother of kings, Eleanor defied many of the constraints placed on her sex in an intensely patriarchal society. But her story also underscores the precariousness of even the most exalted woman's position in medieval society. For all her wealth and influence, Eleanor was still ultimately subject to the will of the men around her. First her husbands, then her sons. Her imprisonment at Henry's hands serves as a stark reminder of the limits of female power in a world where kings still ruled supreme. And yet, Eleanor's enduring fascination for historians and storytellers alike suggests that her legacy transcends the simple trappings of royalty or the constraints of her gender. In many ways, she embodies the restless, questing spirit of an age, a time when the old feudal order was giving way to a new world of courtly romance, chivalric ideals, and the first stirrings of individualism. As a patron of the arts and a leader of the courts of love, grand assemblies where the conventions of courtly romance were celebrated and codified, Eleanor helped to shape the cultural ideals that would define the High Middle Ages. Her influence can be seen in everything from the love poetry of the troubadours to the soaring cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts that still take our breath away today. In Eleanor's story, we see a woman who grappled with the great questions of her age, questions of power, faith, love, and duty, and who left an indelible mark on the world she inhabited. Hers is a tale of ambition and intrigue, of passion and politics, of the struggle to assert oneself in a world that was not always kind to strong-willed women. But it is also, in the end, a deeply human story, a reminder that even the most towering figures of history were flesh and blood people, with all the flaws and foibles that entails. In the flickering candlelight of a long-ago castle chamber, we can imagine Eleanor as she might have been in a rare moment of repose, a woman of indomitable spirit and fierce intelligence, yet still subject to the same yearnings and vulnerabilities that have always animated the human heart. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of Eleanor and her world, a world of crenellated battlements and fluttering banners, of soaring cathedrals and scented gardens, of love and war and the eternal dance of power. And let us remember too that the great sweep of history is ultimately woven from the countless strands of individual lives, each one a story waiting to be told, a legacy waiting to be remembered in the stillness of the night. As we've seen, the lives of medieval monarchs were steeped in extravagance and pageantry, yet also heavily circumscribed by rigid expectations and weighty responsibilities. For all the grandeur of their castles and courts, kings and queens faced a daily existence that was in many ways far from enviable. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance. Born into wealth and privilege as the heiress to a vast duchy, she became Queen of France at the tender age of 15, upon her marriage to King Louis VII. The young couple embarked on the ill-fated Second Crusade together, a grueling journey across thousands of miles that ended in military failure and personal estrangement. After 15 years of marriage and the birth of 2 daughters, Eleanor and Louis's union was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. But Eleanor's story was far from over. Just 8 weeks later, she married the young Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who shortly thereafter ascended the throne as King Henry II of England. As Queen once again, Eleanor proved a formidable political presence, governing England as regent during Henry's long absences and bearing him 8 children, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Yet for all her power and influence, Eleanor's life was tumultuous and constricted by the politics of the day. Her marriage to Henry grew increasingly fractious, and she eventually incited her sons to rebel against their father, a transgression for which she spent 16 years under house arrest. In the end, she outlived both her husbands and all but 2 of her 10 children, dying at the ripe old age of 82 as the Queen Mother and one of the great survivors of the age. Eleanor's remarkable tale highlights the precarious position in which even the most blue-blooded of medieval women found themselves. Subject to the authority of fathers, husbands and sons, queens could wield significant influence from behind the scenes, but always at the risk of censure or punishment for overstepping their bounds. The personal was deeply political, and a royal woman's choice of spouse or ability to produce heirs could spell the difference between dynastic glory and ruin. This was certainly the case for Empress Matilda, the daughter of England's King Henry I. Groomed for greatness from a young age, Matilda was married off to the Holy Roman Emperor as a teenager, and later recalled to England to be named her father's heir after the death of her brother in a shipwreck. But the barons balked at accepting a woman as their ruler, and when Henry died, Matilda's cousin Stephen of Blois rushed to seize the throne, plunging England into a nearly 20-year civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda fought fiercely for what she saw as her birthright, rallying troops to her cause and even escaping a castle under siege by being lowered down the walls in a coffin. She came tantalizingly close to the crown, entering London in triumph and preparing for her coronation. But the fickle citizens soon turned on her, and she was chased out of the city, never to return. In the end, Matilda was forced to settle for seeing her son, the future Henry II, recognised as Stephen's successor, a diplomatic resolution to England's turmoil, but a personally disappointing outcome for a woman who had fought so long and hard to be queen in her own right. The stories of Eleanor and Matilda offer a poignant reminder of the limitations medieval women faced, even at the very apex of society. Queens and empresses might accrue fabulous wealth and wield considerable influence, but their agency was always contingent on the forbearance of the men around them. In a world where martial prowess was the ultimate source of authority, female rulers were only ever regents or intercessors, never truly secure on their thrones. Yet if the political sphere was largely closed off to them, medieval royal women could and did find other outlets for their ambitions. Many carved out significant roles for themselves as patrons of the arts, commissioning magnificent works of art and architecture to adorn their palaces and glorify their memories. Eleanor of Aquitaine was a noted sponsor of troubadours and poets, presiding over a glittering court culture that helped define the early medieval vogue for courtly love. Other queens took a more active role in the religious life of their realms, founding abbeys and monasteries, going on pilgrimages, and even leading crusades, as Eleanor did alongside her first husband. The church offered a rare space where royal women could exercise a degree of autonomy and spiritual authority, even as it relegated them to a subordinate position in the social order. Of course, not all medieval monarchs were as outsized characters as Eleanor or Matilda. For every ruler who left an indelible mark on the historical record, there were scores more who lived and died in relative obscurity, their names recorded only in dry chronicles and faded pedigrees. These forgotten sovereigns may not have shifted the course of nations, but their experiences too are crucial for understanding what life was like for royalty in an age far removed from our own. Consider, for instance, the daily routine of an average medieval king. Although we might think of royal schedules today as jam-packed with court ceremonials, diplomatic engagements, and affairs of state, the reality in medieval times was often considerably more slothful. While the typical day would open with mass at dawn, and perhaps some dispensation of justice or audiences with courtiers, many monarchs spent long stretches in sybaritic ease, drifting from banquet to hunt to gaming table in a haze of idle pleasure-seeking. Writing in the 12th century, the chronicler Walter Map described a royal feast with more than a hint of moralistic judgment. In the midst of wanton joys and unbridled pleasures, with jesters and minstrels, dishes and delicacies fit for kings, dancers and jugglers, All shame was cast aside, all modesty abandoned, and day was turned into night by the torches' flare, and the air resounded with shouts and acclamations. Behind the bluster, one can detect a very human vulnerability. For all their license to indulge in feasts and frivolities, medieval monarchs were expected to live up to nearly impossible ideals of nobility, piety, and honor. They were supposed to be generous patrons, fierce warriors, wise judges, and unimpeachable moral examples, all while navigating the treacherous currents of court politics and dynastic rivalry. It's little wonder that so many sought refuge in life's fleeting pleasures or clung to the comforts of religion. At the end of the day, perhaps that is what is most striking about the medieval, monarchical experience. Not its distance from our own, but its fundamental humanity. Peeling back the ermine robes and shining crowns, one finds people not so different from ourselves. Individuals struggling to reconcile duty and desire, to make their mark on the world while playing the hands they were dealt by fate and circumstance. In a society as rigidly hierarchical as medieval Europe, it could be tempting to see royalty as superhuman paragons, blessed by birthright to glide far above the common run of cares and woe. But examine their lives more closely, and a different picture emerges. One of real men and women shouldering heavy burdens and harboring quiet dreams, much like any of us today. So, when next you settle down for the night and close your heavy eyes, spare a thought for those long ago kings and queens whose stories have drifted down to us through the ages. Imagine yourself behind the high stone walls of a draughty castle bedchamber, feeling the weight of the crown as your head sinks into the pillow. Dream yourself into their world of ceremony and intrigue, languor and longing, and ponder for a moment how much has changed and how much remains the same. As we've seen, the lives of medieval monarchs were shaped by weighty responsibilities and grand displays of power. But perhaps no ruler exemplified the precarious nature of royal authority quite like the 12th century Empress Matilda. Born in 1102 to King Henry I of England and Matilda of Scotland, the young princess enjoyed a privileged upbringing befitting her noble status. She was married at just 8 years old to Henry V, the Holy Roman Emperor, in a lavish ceremony that sealed an important political alliance. At the imperial court in Germany, Matilda thrived. She quickly adapted to the language and customs of her new home, impressing others with her poise and intellect. The teenage empress travelled extensively with her husband, even accompanying him on military campaigns in Italy. Sadly, Henry V died suddenly of illness in 1125, leaving 23-year-old Matilda a widow. With no children of her own, she returned to the English court of her father. King Henry I doted on his only surviving legitimate child. He named Matilda as his heir and forced his barons to swear fealty to her, an unprecedented move, as a woman had never ruled England in her own right before. To bolster her claim, Henry arranged Matilda's marriage to the powerful Geoffrey of Anjou in 1128. The union produced 3 sons, including the future King Henry II. But storm clouds were gathering. Many of England's barons resented the idea of a female sovereign, and Matilda's haughty demeanour at court did little to endear her to would-be subjects. When Henry I died in 1135, the stage was set for a showdown over the royal succession. The king's nephew Stephen of Blois quickly crossed the Channel, seized the crown for himself, and was recognised as ruler by the English Church. Matilda was incensed. With her husband Geoffrey, she rallied supporters to her cause and launched an invasion of England in 1139. The perils of the monarchical life were laid bare as a bitter civil war erupted. For over a decade, the realm was consumed by bloody conflict and shifting alliances as Matilda battled her cousin Stephen for the throne. The period came to be known as the Anarchy. Despite her tenacity, the Empress struggled to win a decisive victory. Her forces captured Stephen in battle in 1141. and Matilda briefly took control of the government. But a series of strategic blunders and her imperious rule alienated erstwhile allies. A popular uprising drove Matilda out of London before her planned coronation. As the war dragged on, the people suffered immensely from the breakdown in law and order. In the end, neither Matilda nor Stephen would truly prevail. The anarchy ended in 1153 with the Treaty of Winchester, which allowed Stephen to keep the throne, but named Matilda's young son Henry as his successor. The following year, Stephen's death cleared the way for Henry II to finally restore stability to England. Matilda's decades-long fight to secure her royal inheritance was over. The dramatic saga of the Empress Matilda illustrates the reality that even the most privileged royal existence could be disrupted by political turmoil. Matilda was born into power and groomed for greatness, but her sex and stubborn personality ultimately hindered her path to the crown. While she never ruled in her own name, Matilda's lifelong quest to secure the throne laid the foundation for the Plantagenet dynasty that would dominate England for over 300 years. Throughout the Middle Ages, royals like Matilda were expected to serve as beacons of culture and learning for their people. In an era when access to education was limited mostly to the wealthy and religious orders, medieval monarchs played an outsized role in fostering the arts and sciences. Kings and queens would wield their vast resources as patrons, supporting the work of scholars and artisans in a grand show of power and prestige. Few things demonstrated the cultural clout of a ruler like commissioning magnificent works of architecture. Soaring cathedrals and imposing castles served as awe-inspiring tributes to both God and king. The Gothic style that flourished in the 12th to 16th centuries was characterized by pointed arches, flying buttresses, intricate sculptures, and luminous stained glass. All technical marvels requiring vast teams of skilled masons, glassworkers, and artisans to build. Take one of the most iconic examples, France's Chartres Cathedral. The bulk of this stunning church was erected between 1194 and 1250 during the reigns of Philip II, Louis VIII, and Louis IX. Its towering 112-foot stone vaulted ceiling, 176 stained glass windows, and ornate royal portal were all cutting-edge innovations for the time. As many as 300 artisans might have laboured continuously over decades to construct this Gothic masterpiece. Of course, no less impressive were the projects royals commissioned for their own residences. Sprawling palaces and fortified castles were built and expanded over centuries, each new generation of rulers adding their own flourishes. The famed Palace of Westminster in London started as a humble 11th century dwelling for Anglo-Saxon kings. But by the time Richard II began rebuilding it in 1394, the palace boasted a magnificent great hall, separate royal apartments, and defensive walls enclosing over 10 acres along the River Thames. Inside their stately homes, medieval monarchs surrounded themselves with beauty. Tapestries were the ultimate status symbol. Incredibly expensive to create, they added warmth, colour, and storytelling to drafty stone halls. Kings from Charlemagne to Henry VIII amassed vast collections of ornate tapestries, like the 14th century Apocalypse series, spanning 472 feet in length. Illuminated manuscripts, paintings, frescoes, silk cushions, and silver plate rounded out the sumptuous decor. But royal patronage extended far beyond the visual arts. Poets, playwrights, and musicians could gain fame and fortune in the orbit of the court. Rulers sponsored lavish performances and competitions, and hired the most renowned creator of the day as official court composers. One could trace the evolution of secular music through luminaries like Guillaume de Machaut, who served John the Blind, King of Bohemia in the 1300s. Perhaps one of the most enduring forms of cultural patronage practiced by medieval monarchs was the founding of universities and libraries. From the 1100s onward, a ruler's prestige became tied to how many scholars they could attract and institutions they could endow. The universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne all had royal patrons. Vast collections amassed in places like the Library of the Louvre made Paris a capital of learning. By supporting the dissemination of knowledge, royals hoped to glorify God and their own reputations. Of course, not all cultural projects were so high-minded. Entertaining the court was a major preoccupation, and some rulers gained fame for their lavish festivities that went on for days. One particularly notorious example was the so-called Bal des Ardents, or Ball of the Burning Men, held by the French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria in 1393. For this wild masquerade, King Charles VI and several lords dressed up as wild men, in costumes of linen soaked with resin for a hairy effect. When the king's brother approached with a torch, the highly flammable outfits caught fire. Several men were burned alive, though the king was saved by the quick actions of his young aunt. The night's gruesome turn was considered an ill omen, foreshadowing Charles VI's later bouts of madness. Such tragedies aside, the cultural legacy left by medieval royalty is undeniable. The period marked a flowering of creativity and learning, with rulers leading the way as patrons. By commissioning magnificent buildings, art, and institutions of knowledge, kings and queens hoped to achieve a kind of immortality beyond their own reigns. And for we moderns peering back through the centuries, these tangible remnants of royal lives help bring a long-ago era into vivid focus. While it can be tempting to romanticize the pageantry and luxury of medieval royalty, the day-to-day reality for even the most powerful rulers was often quite constrained. The famous axiom, uneasy lies, the head that wears a crown, captures the suffocating pressure and isolation that could characterize life at the very top of the hierarchy. Even for anointed monarchs, there was little privacy or personal freedom. A royal's daily existence revolved around ritual, with each hour stipulated by religious services, official ceremonies, court functions, and prescribed leisure activities. Every action was governed by strict protocol and etiquette, from how lowly servants could approach them to what dishes could be served at a banquet. And a sprawling entourage of attendants, courtiers, and guards meant a king or queen was rarely, if ever, truly alone. Consider the claustrophobic conditions of King Charles VI of France, who reigned from 1380 to 1422. From childhood, Charles was monitored constantly, his tutors and minders tracking his every movement and conversation. He had to make a formal entreaty to the royal council for permission to visit his wife in another castle. His descent into madness as an adult only tightened the net of supervision around him. Though sovereigns wielded vast power in theory, they were often constrained by webs of tradition and aristocratic power in practice. Running a realm required keeping landed nobles happy, which meant granting them the right offices, marriages, and honours at court. And before the rise of professional bureaucracies, kings relied on their great magnates to carry out everything from collecting taxes to fielding armies, giving them immense leverage. Those who failed to placate their noble subjects could face dire consequences. The Barons' Wars of the 2600s England saw King Henry III taken hostage by a rogue confederation of lords after they felt he had slighted their ancient rights and privileges. Henry was forced to accept reforms limiting royal authority and giving more power to a council of nobles. The crown's dependence on the goodwill of aristocrats was laid bare. The most intimate aspects of a ruler's life were dictated by politics as well. Marriages, especially for women, were almost always arranged with diplomatic aims in mind. Kings and queens were seen as valuable pieces on the dynastic chessboard, used to seal alliances or territorial claims. The wishes of the betrothed were rarely a factor. Princes and princesses often met their new spouses for the first time at the altar. Once wed, a royal couple's chief duty was to produce heirs to continue the dynasty. This pressure was especially intense for women, whose worth was often measured by their fertility. the 15th century Margaret of Anjou endured 7 years of marriage to King Henry VI, without conceiving before finally giving birth to a son, Edward. But when the long-awaited prince was disinherited amid the Wars of the Roses, Margaret transformed into a fierce warrior, leading armies into battle on his behalf. Of course, not all royal marriages were cold political alliances. The great love story of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile in the 1200s is documented in adoring letters that capture their mutual affection. And the 14th century saw the reign of the princes in the Tower, the devoted Edward II and his friend Piers Gaveston, who shared an emotional and perhaps romantic bond. But even these relationships played out on a public stage, subject to the scrutiny of courtiers. Despite the immense privilege of their rank, royalty sacrificed much of their personal autonomy. The crown's seclusion also meant a formal distance from their subjects. Glimpses behind the carefully controlled facade, like Henry VI's melancholic breakdowns or Edward II's grief over the death of Gaveston, reminded the realm of the humanity of their rulers. But more often, what people saw, and what history records, is the public persona of an exalted but inaccessible figure. In the end, perhaps the greatest constraint on a medieval monarch was an unrelenting pressure to measure up to the lofty ideals of the role. Kings were to be paragons of justice, founts of honor, defenders of the church. Queens should be models of beauty, virtue, and piety. They must appear strong but merciful, dignified but generous. And through their patronage and conquest, they had to build a worthy legacy for the ages. Imagine the weight of these expectations on even the most high-born shoulders. Peering back through the mists of time, one almost sees the glittering mask of royalty slip aside, revealing the all-too-human faces beneath the crowns. The bejeweled robes and heraldic banners cannot conceal the cares and passions of people like any other. People who laughed and wept and raged between the grand ceremonies and stately portraits. As the velvet curtains of history fall closed on the pageant of medieval royalty, perhaps this is what lingers in the imagination. Not just the majestic castles and opulent treasures, but the individual men and women who bore the lonely burden of rule. While monarchs' lives were in many ways impossibly distant from our own, to empathize across the ages is to sense an inner world that was achingly familiar, whether crowned or common born. Good night, and may your dreams be graced by the gilded shadows of yesteryear, the regal phantoms who, for all their legendary deeds and outsized renown, were still souls much like you or I. Rest now, and ponder what life was truly like for those who reigned so long ago, in an era lost to antiquity, but not beyond our imagining. Until next time, fare thee well, my royal dreamer. Continuing from where we left off, let us delve deeper into the remarkable life and times of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who shaped the course of history in medieval Europe. Born in 1122, Eleanor was the daughter of William X, the wealthy and powerful Duke of Aquitaine. From a young age, she was groomed for greatness, receiving an education befitting a future queen. She learned to read and write, a rare accomplishment for a woman in those times, and was tutored in languages, music, and the arts of courtly love. At the tender age of 15, Eleanor's life took a dramatic turn when her father died unexpectedly on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. As the eldest of his two daughters, Eleanor inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, making her the most eligible bride in Europe. Suitors from far and wide sought her hand in marriage, vying for the chance to control her immense wealth and territory. In the end, it was Louis VII, the young King of France, who won Eleanor's hand. They were married in 1137, just a few months after Louis had ascended to the throne. At first, the union seemed a happy one, with Eleanor bringing a much-needed infusion of wealth and culture to the French court. She introduced the troubadour tradition of courtly love, sponsoring poets and musicians who sang of chivalry and romance. But despite their auspicious beginnings, Eleanor and Louis's marriage soon began to fray. Eleanor was a strong-willed and independent woman, accustomed to ruling her own lands. She chafed at the restrictions placed on her by the conservative French court and the pious Louis, who disapproved of her extravagance and worldly ways. Matters came to a head in 1147, when Louis announced his intention to lead the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. Eleanor, ever the adventurer, insisted on accompanying him, along with a retinue of her ladies and troubadours. The crusade was a disaster, with the French army decimated by disease and the harsh desert conditions. Rumours swirled that Eleanor had engaged in an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch, further straining her relationship with Louis. Upon their return to France, the royal couple's estrangement was complete. After 15 years of marriage and 2 daughters, they sought an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity, as they were third cousins. The annulment was granted by Pope Eugene III, and Eleanor was once again free to marry. Her choice of husband this time would have even more profound consequences. Just 8 weeks after her annulment, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who stood to inherit the English throne. Their union created a vast empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, and would eventually give rise to the Plantagenet dynasty that ruled England for more than 300 years. As Queen of England, Eleanor proved a formidable consort to Henry II. She bore him 8 children, including 5 sons, and served as regent when Henry was away on campaign. She continued to patronize the arts and learning, and is credited with establishing the Court of Love at Poitiers, where troubadours and poets gathered to debate the finer points of courtly romance. But Eleanor's relationship with Henry, like her marriage to Louis, was tempestuous. Henry was a notorious womanizer, fathering numerous illegitimate children, and the couple often quarreled over matters of state. In 1173, Eleanor's sons, led by the eldest Henry the Young King, rebelled against their father, seeking greater power and autonomy. Eleanor supported her sons in the revolt, which ultimately failed. As punishment, Henry had Eleanor imprisoned for the next 16 years, moving her from castle to castle to prevent any further plots. It was not until Henry's death in 1189 that Eleanor was finally released from captivity. By then, she was 67 years old, but her indomitable spirit was undiminished. She outlived Henry by 15 years, serving as a trusted advisor to her sons Richard I and John, who both became kings of England. She undertook diplomatic missions, negotiated treaties and alliances, and even travelled to Spain to choose a bride for her grandson, the future Louis VIII of France. Eleanor's legacy as a patron of the arts and a champion of courtly love endured long after her death in 1204, at the ripe old age of 82. The troubadour tradition she helped to establish spread throughout Europe, influencing poetry, music, and literature for centuries to come. Her descendants, the Plantagenets, would go on to shape the course of English history, giving rise to such legendary figures as Edward I, Edward III, and Richard III. In many ways, Eleanor of Aquitaine epitomized the contradictions and complexities of life for medieval royalty. She was a woman of immense power and influence, yet she was also subject to the whims and desires of the men in her life. She was a patron of the arts and a champion of courtly love, yet she was also a shrewd political operator who used her wealth and connections to advance her own interests and those of her children. Through her long and eventful life, Eleanor navigated the treacherous waters of medieval politics with skill and determination, leaving an indelible mark on the history of England and France. She remains a fascinating figure to this day, a woman who defied the conventions of her time and left a legacy that endures more than 800 years after her death. As we move on to explore other aspects of royal life in medieval times, it's worth keeping Eleanor's story in mind. Hers was a life of privilege and power, yet also one of great challenges and adversity. In her triumphs and her struggles, she reflects the larger themes and trends that shaped the lives of medieval monarchs, from the weighty responsibilities of rulership to the personal sacrifices and compromises that came with the crown. So let us now turn our attention to those responsibilities and sacrifices and examine more closely the unique lifestyle of royalty in the Middle Ages. As we do so, we may find that the glittering facade of wealth and privilege conceals a more complex and often troubling reality, one in which even the most powerful rulers were subject to forces beyond their control. As the sun rose over the medieval landscape, the day began for the monarchs and their household. The first order of business was usually religious devotion. Kings and queens were expected to be paragons of piety, attending daily mass and spending hours in prayer each day. Many had private chapels within their lavish residences, where they could worship in quiet contemplation, attended by priests and ladies in waiting. Religion suffused every aspect of a medieval ruler's life. The Queen's Day often revolved around the royal children. Most queens bore many offspring, as a large family was seen as a blessing and a safeguard for the dynasty. But childbirth was perilous in an age before modern medicine. Queens frequently died in childbed, as did infants and young children. Those princes and princesses who survived enjoyed a privileged but often short childhood. Royal children were usually raised separately from their parents, in a different part of the palace or even a separate residence altogether. There, they were tended to by an extensive staff of nurses, tutors, servants, and companions. A princess would learn domestic skills like needlework, as well as dancing, music, and social graces. Education for princes was rather more expansive, including military training, as well as academic subjects like languages, mathematics, law, and history. All were rigorously schooled in religion and courtly etiquette. But perhaps the most important lessons were in dynastic politics. From an early age, royal children knew their marriages would be arranged for political reasons, to cement alliances or bring powerful territories under the family's influence. Romance was a luxury that royalty could rarely afford. Some royal children were engaged while still in the cradle, their personal happiness a small matter compared to the good of the realm. One famous example of a childhood betrothal that shaped history was that of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born around 1122, Eleanor was the eldest daughter of William, Duke of Aquitaine, who possessed the largest and richest province in what is now France. The willful and high-spirited Eleanor became his heiress and was much sought after as a bride. She married the future King Louis VII of France when she was only about 15 years old. Beautiful, wealthy, and strong-minded, Eleanor was not content to be a demure queen consort. When her pious husband Louis joined the Second Crusade in 1147 to fight in the Holy Land, Eleanor shocked many by insisting on going with him. Accompanied by hundreds of her ladies, the queen set out in high style, wearing armor and carrying a lance. But the crusade did not go well for the French, and Louis and Eleanor's marriage became strained, not least because she failed to produce a male heir. Matters came to a head after they returned, and Eleanor sought an annulment on grounds of consanguinity, or being too closely related. The embarrassed Louis agreed, and their marriage was dissolved in 1152, leaving Eleanor single and in possession of her huge inheritance from Aquitaine. Being a great heiress made Eleanor a prime catch on the medieval marriage market. She soon wed a dynamic young nobleman named Henry, who 2 years later would ascend to the throne of England as Henry II. By him, Eleanor bore 8 children, including 5 sons, 2 of whom would become kings in their turn. But as Eleanor aged, her relationship with the explosive and philandering Henry deteriorated. After Eleanor supported a rebellion by their sons against Henry, the furious king had the queen placed under house arrest, where she remained for over a decade. In the first year of her confinement, 1173, Eleanor's eldest surviving son, known to history as Richard the Lionheart, once again rebelled against his father Henry. Richard, his mother's favourite, may have been emboldened knowing Eleanor supported his claim. He went to war alongside his younger brother Geoffrey, and at one point, the sons actually took their own father prisoner. But Henry finally subdued the rebellion, only agreeing to free Eleanor after Richard submitted and begged for forgiveness. Throughout her long imprisonment, Eleanor remained a strong influence over her sons, fueling their ambitions and giving advice through letters. When Henry II finally died in 1189, Richard ascended to the throne, and his first act as king was to order his beloved mother released. On Richard's departure for the Third Crusade, he installed Eleanor as Regent of England, allowing her to wield power openly for the first time. As regent, and during Richard's long absences and captivity abroad, Eleanor worked tirelessly to raise his ransom, negotiate with the Pope on his behalf, and help rule his territories, travelling ceaselessly across England and France. The indomitable Eleanor lived to the remarkable age of 82, having spent her final years in her favourite abbey, Fontevraud. Eleanor was a shining example of how a medieval queen could carve out a significant sphere of influence despite the constraints placed upon women in her time. She cultivated an image of herself as a cultured patron of the arts, and indeed the tradition of courtly love, poetry flourished at her court, where Eleanor encouraged troubadours to write verses extolling the virtues of noble ladies. But Eleanor was an exception in many ways. For most medieval queens, their chief duty was to provide the king with male heirs. Sons were infinitely preferred over daughters to inherit the throne and carry on the family dynasty. Bearing healthy children was such an essential queenly role that infertile queens were frequently cast off, their barrenness seen as a curse or judgment from God. The pressure on queens to procreate meant that many royal women were almost constantly in a cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery for most of their fertile years. But they were also expected to preside gracefully over court festivities, even when in a delicate condition. And of course, the rigours of childbirth itself were a recurring danger that claimed many royal mothers and babies. This was the case for Queen Philippa of Hainault, wife of King Edward III of England. Philippa was a devoted consort who provided Edward with many children, including 5 sons who lived to adulthood. She held the reins of government as regent for Edward during his long military campaigns abroad. Beloved for her kindness and piety, Philippa was an ideal medieval queen. But bearing so many royal children ultimately cost Philippa her life. She died at age 55 in August 1369, days after giving birth to her 14th child. Edward was devastated by the loss of his queen, and she was deeply mourned by her people. Her grandson would one day inherit the throne as the ill-fated Richard II. While sons were the most coveted royal offspring, a medieval king also hoped for at least one daughter, who could be married off to a rival ruler to seal a peace treaty or secure an alliance. Daughters were useful dynastic bargaining chips in the unending game of feudal realpolitik. The marriage contract of a princess was often hammered out through months of tense negotiations, with every clause and condition painstakingly spelled out, and her dowry a matter of fierce haggling. Once wed, she was expected to loyally promote her birth family's interests in her new land. Queens who failed in this risked being branded traitors or worse. Most royal daughters, knowing no other way of life, accepted their fate stoically, doing their dynastic duty. A few long-suffering wives even came to love their husbands. But many led isolated and unhappy lives in a foreign court, far from home, valued only for their wedding dowry and reproductive capacity. So for a royal bride, whether negotiating her betrothal or navigating the intrigues of a new court, the best ally she could find was often her own mother. Queens worked tirelessly to advance the marriages of their children, calling in favours, smoothing over conflicts, and plotting against rivals. Once a queen's daughter was safely delivered to her husband, she strove to keep up a regular correspondence, sending letters full of news, advice, and warnings. A royal mother's counsel was often her daughter's greatest asset, as she tried to find her footing in an unfamiliar court. This special bond between queens and princesses was one of the most important relationships in the medieval world. Empress Matilda was one royal daughter who could have used her mother's guidance. Matilda was born in 1102 to King Henry I of England and his wife Matilda of Scotland. The young princess lost her mother at age 7, leaving her open to the machinations of her father. When Matilda was only 8 years old, King Henry arranged her betrothal to the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, who was more than 15 years her senior. The little princess was sent to Germany in 1110 to be raised at her future husband's court, where she was educated as befitted an empress to be. The imperial couple married in 1114, despite the bride only being 12 years old. As Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, Matilda seemed destined for greatness. But her husband died in 1125 after only 11 years of marriage. The widowed Matilda, still only 23, was suddenly left without a clear role. She had failed to bear the emperor a child, and his successor had no use for her. With few options, Matilda was forced to return to the court of her father, King Henry. Matters became more dire for Matilda when her younger brother, Henry's only legitimate son, drowned in the disastrous White Ship disaster of 1120. Suddenly, Henry had no clear heir, and many of his barons were uneasy at the thought of a woman inheriting the throne. But Henry forged ahead with his plan. The determined King Henry forced his barons to swear an oath to accept Matilda as his heir. He then arranged a second marriage for the reluctant Matilda, this time to the 13 years younger Geoffrey of Anjou. It was a tempestuous match, with the arrogant Matilda and proud Geoffrey frequently quarrelling. But the power couple eventually came to terms and had 3 sons. When Henry I died in 1135, it seemed that Matilda's path to the English throne was clear, with Geoffrey acting as her consort and protector. But many of the barons went back on their oath to Henry, and the throne was instead claimed by Henry's charming nephew, Stephen of Blois. Matilda was outraged at being passed over. She rallied troops and supporters, leading them in an invasion of England in 1139. Matilda captured Stephen in battle in 1141, and for a few months actually ruled in London as Lady of the English. But her haughty demeanour alienated the citizens, and she was soon forced to flee as Stephen's allies rallied. The resulting civil war and breakdown of royal authority as Stephen and Matilda's factions vied for control became known as the Anarchy. For nearly 20 years, the two rivals continued to struggle and maneuver for advantage as the kingdom erupted in bloodshed and chaos. Contemporary chroniclers lamented that Christ and his saints slept as the war dragged on. Finally, in 1153, the exhausted parties reached a compromise called the Treaty of Winchester. Stephen would remain as king for the rest of his life, with Matilda's son Henry named as his heir. The following year, Stephen died, and the 21-year-old Henry ascended the throne as Henry II, beginning a new era for England. Matilda herself retired quietly to Normandy, where she died in 1167 at age 65, knowing she had fought like a lioness to put her son on the throne. In the end, she lost her long struggle to be queen in her own right. But through her descendants, including the formidable Henry II and celebrated Richard the Lionheart, Matilda left a towering legacy over the English monarchy for generations to come. The saga of Matilda and Stephen demonstrates how uncertain even a seemingly ironclad royal succession could become in the chaos of the Middle Ages. With life expectancy so much lower than today, the death of a king could plunge a realm into disarray if the heir was too young, absent, or disputed. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Empress Matilda, who lived long enough, could wield great influence as queen mothers and regents for underage sons. Matilda's daughter-in-law Eleanor of Aquitaine was especially skilled at using her power behind the throne to steer events, even dominating the royal court for a time. But such a prominent role for women was the exception rather than the rule in the deeply patriarchal society of medieval Europe. Women, even royal ones, were meant to be submissive, pious, and decorous, modeling the virtues of the ideal courtly lady. Those queens who openly flouted these expectations, asserting themselves too strongly into the male spheres of governance and warfare, frequently met with criticism and censure. Chroniclers denounced them as unnaturally ambitious viragos overstepping their proper womanly role. This was the case with Queen Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Isabella, beautiful and clever, despised her ineffectual, pleasure-loving husband and his male favourites, who held undue influence at court. In 1325, Isabella fled to France, where she took a lover, the ambitious nobleman Roger Mortimer. The scandalous pair gathered an invasion force and attacked England, capturing the hapless Edward and forcing him to abdicate in favour of his teenage son, Edward III. Edward II soon died in captivity, almost certainly murdered on the orders of Isabella and Mortimer. The pair then ruled openly as regents, their brazen affair an open secret. But young King Edward chafed under his mother's thumb. In a palace coup, he arrested Isabella and put her lover Mortimer on trial. The Queen was spared execution and allowed to retire with dignity to a comfy exile. Mortimer, however, was promptly hanged as a traitor. Isabella's story is a cautionary tale of how even powerful queens could swiftly fall from grace if they failed to maintain the proper image of virtuous femininity. In the harsh world of medieval politics, royals danced on a razor's edge, where one wrong move could mean disgrace or death. When those missteps involved queens and their lovers, the scandal was especially juicy to royal watchers. By the later Middle Ages, most kings had resigned themselves to their wives taking discreet lovers, so long as they were reasonably cautious and bore the king's children. Of course, kings themselves frequently strayed with mistresses. It was practically expected for lusty royal husbands. Henry II of England, Eleanor of Aquitaine's spouse, famously kept a whole string of mistresses, most notably the fair Rosamond, the comely young daughter of a knight. Henry ensconced his beloved Rosamond in a sort of love nest, a picturesque bower at the centre of a hedge maze at his park in Woodstock. According to legend, a jealous Queen Eleanor eventually found a way into the labyrinth and confronted her nubile young rival, offering her the choice of a dagger or a cup of poison. The tale's ominous implication of murder only added to the fair Rosamond's romantic mystique. The reality, as usual, was doubtless more prosaic. Some historians believe Rosamond may have become a nun with Eleanor's knowledge, as a respectable way to remove her from the royal court. In any case, Rosamond apparently died of natural causes, as a charitable foundation was later established at Godstow Abbey in her name. The enduring legend of Rosamond and Eleanor demonstrates how tales of courtly love, with adulterous passions, jealous rages and tragic endings, so captivated the imaginations of medieval nobility. Such scandalous romances, whether real or embellished, were the favourite gossip around palace fireplaces and banquet tables. So, where did medieval royals do most of their philandering and politicking? Much of it occurred at their favourite royal residences and power bases. Kings, queens, and their courts were always on the move between castles, keeping an eye on their far-flung domains. The great royal domiciles of the Middle Ages were not just military fortifications, but also political nerve centres and stages for court pageantry and intrigue. The mightiest castles boasted concentric rings of stout walls, towers, baileys and keeps, plus lavish living quarters decked out in rich tapestries, fine furnishings and precious plate. A splendid example was William the Conqueror's White Tower, begun in the 1070s, the first and largest building at the Tower of London complex. Though meant to dominate and intimidate William's new English subjects, the White Tower also functioned as a showy royal residence, complete with a magnificent Great Hall, stately apartments, and a lovely chapel. Many exquisite examples of medieval royal apartments still survive today. One of the most opulent was the Palais de la Cité in Paris, the main seat of the French monarchy from the 10th century until Charles V moved the court to the Louvre in the 1360s. The Palais de la Cité was a vast complex combining a fortress, a prison, law courts, and a dazzling royal residence. At its heart was the sumptuous Grande Salle, a hypostyle hall with soaring vaults supported by colourful marble columns. The vault was painted a deep, inky blue, dotted with golden fleurs de lis, evoking the night sky. Magnificent statues of French kings lined the walls, staring down regally at courtiers and visitors. Though the Grande Salle was mostly destroyed by a fire in 1618, we can still marvel at one of its exquisite side chambers, the fairy tale Sainte-Chapelle. This glorious Gothic chapel was built by King Louis IX in the 1240s to house the supposed crown of thorns and other relics of Christ's Passion. The Sainte-Chapelle is famed for its dazzling stained glass windows, an ethereal expanse of luminous jewel tones soaring nearly 100 feet above the marble floor. Brilliantly hued scenes from the Old Testament and Passion cycle mesmerize the eye, awash with glowing. Life for royalty in medieval times was a world unto itself, set apart from the toil and concerns of the common people. While the lives of kings and queens were undoubtedly privileged, full of luxury and power beyond imagining for most, they also carried heavy burdens and weighty expectations. Their daily routines were marked by strict ceremony, onerous duties, and constant public scrutiny. The royal lifestyle was at once decadent and demanding, a glittering facade masking very human struggles within. Perhaps no monarch better embodies the paradoxes of royalty than Queen Philippa of England, devoted wife of Edward III and mother to no less than 12 children. Born a noblewoman of Hainaut, now in modern Belgium, the young Philippa came to England at just 13 to be wed to the 15-year-old Edward. It was an arranged match, like most royal marriages then, intended to secure a political alliance between their two lands. Yet despite its pragmatic origins, the union would blossom into a deeply loving and influential partnership. Edward and Philippa's marriage was a pillar of strength during a tumultuous time for the English crown. Not long after taking the throne, Edward embroiled England in what would become the 100 Years' War, staking a tenuous claim to the French crown through his mother. As he led armies across the Channel year after year, Philippa often served as regent in his stead, capably governing the realm. She earned widespread respect for her wisdom, grace, and charity, a trusted queen who embodied the ideals of the age. But Philippa's life was far from the tranquil domesticity enjoyed by her humblest subjects. When not holding court or reviewing matters of state, she was frequently pregnant, confined to her chambers for long stretches. Childbirth was a perilous affair even for queens, and not all of Philippa's babies would survive infancy. Those who did faced an upbringing of rigid formality, every moment structured and supervised. The natural rambunctiousness of childhood tamed by decorum. Exhausting as this cycle of child-rearing was, it was also Philippa's chief duty and a source of dynastic pride. Her sons would go on to be the famed Black Prince and the powerful John of Gaunt. Her daughters she raised to be gracious and capable queens. In an age when the primary role of royal women was to secure the succession, Philippa excelled. Yet she strove to be more than a queen. She made herself a true partner to Edward and an influential force in her own right. When not consumed by matters of state or family, Philippa embraced the refined pastimes and pageantry of court. She had a passion for fine clothing and is said to have kept a wardrobe unmatched in opulence. She looked regal even by the sumptuous standards of 14th century nobility, swathed in jewels and billowing gowns. Music was another great love, her court forever filled with minstrels and troubadours. She was a cultured patron of the arts and learning, collecting exquisite books and objets d'art from the continent. Yet Philippa also took her Christian faith most seriously, as any proper monarch must in medieval times. She devoted long hours to prayer and masses in the royal chapel, and practiced charity on a grand scale befitting her station. Her touching concern for the poor was much remarked upon, and convents, hospitals, and almshouses across England enjoyed her support. She was forever interceding to the king for mercy on prisoners, or pardon for criminals condemned. Hers was a gentle and moderating influence on the throne. Thus, even a queen renowned for her virtue had to walk a delicate line, balancing piety and dynastic duty, stately glamour and common compassion. Whether ensconced in sumptuous apartments attended by scores of ladies or on her knees in solemn prayer, Philippa had to be every inch the queen at all times, gracious but commanding, admirable from every angle. Edward appeared to adore her, remained relatively faithful, and mourned her most deeply at her passing. Yet he would take a mistress in her lifetime. One could only expect so much of a king. This was the central paradox of a queen's life. She must project an image of unassailable majesty, yet in truth, even her marriage was a political contract first and foremost. She must bear as many heirs as she could and raise them to rule, yet forever live apart from them and their simple childhood delights. She must act as intercessor for her people, yet never forget her place far above them. She enjoyed comforts and luxuries unthinkable to most, yet kingly whims might negate them at any time. To be royal was to live atop a pedestal, resplendent to behold, but confined on all sides. When English subjects gazed up and saw Philippa and her family in all their finery, they saw mythic figures more than flesh and blood. When we look back from our vantage point today, it can be hard to see past the crowns and castles and courtly fanfare, but Philippa's story reminds us that inside the royal robes beat a human heart, with cares and contradictions not so different from our own. So come, let us return to the halls of Windsor and feel like 14th century royalty for a moment. Imagine yourself in the embroidered velvet gown, rubies and sapphires sparkling at your throat, a golden circlet upon your brow. Minstrels play a delicate air on vielle and cittern, while you dine on glazed peacock and marchpane subtleties. Your children scamper off to the gardens for a game of cups and ball. Later nights will joust for your honour in the tilt yard. But linger not over long on these pleasant scenes, for affairs of state await in the council chamber, and the clerics have endless documents to be reviewed and sealed. A crowd of petitioners gather in the outer ward, begging justice and favour. There are disputes to settle between fractious lords, and the Scots are raiding the northern marches again. Your eldest son, still just a youth, must away to France and the battlefield, and all the while you feel a new babe quickening in your womb. Such is the life for medieval royalty. The great wheel of history turns on, and we must turn with it, leaving Philippa and her vanished world behind. But let us carry with us a certain empathy for those long ago lords and ladies. For in the dark behind our closed eyelids, we may yet catch a glimpse of them in their private chambers, stripped of regalia and reputation. And there we might recognize kindred spirits, more like us than the storybooks suggest. The crown weighs heavy, but the humanity within endures. The crown jewels, of course, were among the most prized symbols of royal wealth and majesty during medieval times. These priceless coronation regalia, crowns, orbs, scepters, and swords were encrusted with glittering rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds the size of quail eggs. They were worn by the monarch during the most solemn ceremonies and state occasions. Kings and queens took great pride in commissioning ever more opulent crown jewels, each more dazzling than the last. Such ostentatious displays of riches weren't just for vanity's sake. They were calculated political statements meant to awe subjects and rivals alike with the vast resources at the sovereign's command. In an era before mass media, the bedazzling spectacle of a monarch decked out in jewel-encrusted finery was a powerful propaganda tool. It reinforced the divine right of kings, the notion that rulers were anointed by God to reign over their kingdoms. The crown jewels invoked biblical kings like Solomon, famed for their wisdom, but also their stupendous wealth and earthly glory. When worn in majestic cathedrals during holy festivals, they linked the worldly might of the monarchy to the spiritual power of the church. And when flaunted before foreign emissaries, they advertised the prosperity, sophistication, and indomitable strength of the realm. Amassing such fabulous royal treasuries was an expensive business. Skilled craftsmen devoted years to perfecting a single piece. The precious metals and gemstones were sourced from the farthest corners of the known world. Gold from Africa, rubies from Asia, emeralds from Egypt. Such far-flung origins only enhanced the mystique of the jewels. The greatest medieval goldsmiths and lapidaries, experts in working with precious metals and gems, were lured to royal courts with promises of generous salaries, lavish workshops, and exalted titles. In some kingdoms, these artisans took on almost priestly status. Their arcane knowledge of metallurgy and gem cutting, considered akin to alchemy. Different cultures developed their own distinctive styles of royal regalia. The Holy Roman emperors sported an octagonal crown, mimicking the walls of Jerusalem. Byzantines favoured pendilia, bejewelled ornaments hanging from the crown over the ruler's cheeks and ears. English kings often held sceptres topped with a cross or dove to symbolise just and peaceful sovereignty. Protecting such immensely valuable royal possessions was paramount. The crown jewels were locked away in the deepest castle vaults, guarded around the clock by the most incorruptible soldiers. Merely to handle them without permission was considered treasonous. But for all the best efforts of even the most eagle-eyed warders, the dazzling allure of the jewels sometimes proved too tempting. In 1303, the treasury at Westminster Abbey was daringly robbed. The golden crown, sceptres and rings of Edward the Confessor were stolen by a mysterious band of thieves. Sacrilegious as the crime was, one can almost admire the audacity of these bandits, bold as brass, making off with the most jealously guarded treasures in all the land. The repercussions were swift and terrible. Every able-bodied man in London was ordered to help with the hunt. The city gates were sealed for days. Dozens of suspects were rounded up, and one presumes the jailers weren't too fussed about observing Magna Carta rights. Though most of the jewels were eventually recovered, the crown was damaged beyond repair. This legendary heist later inspired many a ballad and morality tale, with the moral being, of course, that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a thief to escape the king's justice. For commoners, even glimpsing the crown jewels was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Perhaps a chance peek as the royal procession wound its way to Westminster for a coronation, or a tantalising glint of gold as the monarch sat enthroned in full regalia. Ironically then, for most medieval folk, the royal crown jewels were like that famous Arthurian quest object, a glimpse of the Holy Grail, radiant and otherworldly, but forever out of reach behind castle walls. Marvellous to dream about though, those huge, hypnotically sparkling gemstones, the warmth of that soft, lustrous beaten gold, the sheer majesty embodied in each priceless, timeless treasure. However much the jewels bedazzled the public imagination, for the royals themselves, they could sometimes be a weighty reminder of the burdens of kingship. The 11th century German king Henry III reportedly despised wearing his crown, as it gave him headaches. The 13th century English monarch John was said to have pawned his jewels to finance his disastrous wars, a sign of his spendthrift ways. Perhaps it was a relief to set aside the £8 crown at the end of a long ceremony a day. But even in private, royals couldn't entirely escape the regalia. They wore smaller jewelled diadems and coronets as part of their everyday dress. Their furniture and tableware was festooned with gold and silver. Jewels glittered from every scabbard, goblet and slipper. Such all-encompassing opulence was customary and expected. A medieval king couldn't very well greet the Venetian ambassadors wearing a monk's rough-spun robes and a wooden bowl. Royalty had an image to uphold, one synonymous with the finest things in life, meant to mirror God's heavenly splendor and awe the masses into obedience. In a world of backbreaking poverty for most, rulers had to both look and live the part of the elect. A race of gilded demigods, draped in the most precious earthly treasures known to man. As much as we moderns might raise an eyebrow at such conspicuous consumption, there's no denying the sheer aesthetic pleasure of these magnificent artifacts. Just picture the coronation crown of the Holy Roman Empire, a soaring gold affair studded with sapphires, pearls, and an enormous ocean blue aquamarine. Or the Alfred Jewel, that Anglo-Saxon amulet with its enigmatic enamel portrait as vividly coloured as the day it was fired. These sublime treasures still have the power to enchant and inspire. And though the kings and queens who once wore them are long gone, the crown jewels remain, tangible symbols of the wealth, power, and glory of royalty in times past. More than mere ornaments, they are the glittering stuff of legends. Of course, not all royal treasures were as flashy as gem-encrusted crowns. Monarchs also cherished more understated heirlooms that were no less significant. Take the coronation spoon used to anoint English sovereigns with holy oil, a battered little silver thing about as plain as a bean spoon. But it dated back to the 12th century and was believed to be the only relic to survive the plundering of the crown jewels in the English Civil War. As such, it was imbued with sacral and historic value far beyond its appearance. Or consider the bizarre Reichenau sword and scabbard, a 10th century German weapon with an ornate scabbard of chased silver, patterned with fantastical faces melting into each other. Scholars still argue whether the unsettling designs were meant to evoke the souls of warriors devoured by the blade, or a kingly lineage dissolving into the next. In any case, it is a sublimely eerie piece of craftsmanship and a window into the more outre side of medieval aesthetics. But such grim-seeming oddities were the exception in royal treasure hoards. For the most part, the emphasis was firmly on displays of wealth, beauty, and exquisite workmanship that attested to the refinement and might of the ruling class. Where commoners made do with crudely thatched huts, rag clothing, and leather trenchers, the king and his court enjoyed the ne plus ultra in every department. The most intricate tapestries, the most towering Gothic cathedrals, the most beguiling music. Luxuries like spices, silks, and stained glass were imported at staggering expense from the far reaches of the globe. Teams of tailors, goldsmiths, and furniture makers were kept on permanent retainer to furnish an endless stream of sumptuous goods. The royal wardrobe alone was vast enough to clothe a small city, from ermine-trimmed robes to jeweled slippers to gold-plaited underpants. No wonder that, for the average swineherd or scullery maid, the royal lifestyle seemed as impossibly remote and marvelous as that of archangels or fairy kings. And no wonder that the ultimate fairy tale ending was for a humble hero to ascend to royalty, whether by pulling a sword from a stone, or marrying a prince, or simply waking to discover it had all been a beautiful dream. Yet even in their finest silks and most pompous ceremonies, medieval monarchs were only flesh and blood. They weren't immune to the same everyday ailments, emotions, and indignities as the lowliest peasant. One can picture the royals nursing headaches after too much Rhenish wine, or discreetly scratching their lice-ridden wigs, or grumpily changing out of those stiff brocaded tunics into something a tad more comfy. It's this human touch that makes them relatable across the yawning centuries. Underneath all the padded pomp and circumstance, kings and queens worried about their unruly offspring, griped about their gambling debts, and suffered from indigestion, just like anyone else. They simply did so while swanning about in palatial splendor and sporting gem-studded underwear. So as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of those long-ago lords and ladies holding court in halls hung with unicorn tapestries, supping on gold-flecked pies and rose-petal puddings, dancing the farandole by candlelight in velvet sleeves and pearl-sewn veils. A world of wonders as fabulous and far off as an illuminated page from a book of hours, yet inhabited by royals who were just as human as you or I, once you pried off their crowns. Good night, sweet princes and princesses of the distant past, and flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. As we've seen, the lives of medieval monarchs were filled with grand ceremony and courtly splendor, but also weighty responsibilities and religious devotion. Perhaps no rulers embodied these contrasts quite like the 14th century English King Edward III and his queen consort, Philippa of Hainaut. Edward was crowned at the tender age of 14 after the forced abdication of his father, Edward II. The young king quickly proved himself a capable ruler, a military commander, leading England into the early stages of what would become the 100 Years' War with France. Edward asserted his claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, the so-called she-wolf of France. This conflict would consume much of Edward's reign and come to define the chivalric ideals of his court. Alongside her ambitious husband, Queen Philippa presided over a glittering royal household teeming with nobles, courtiers, servants, and visiting dignitaries. Philippa was no passive consort. She actively engaged in diplomacy, even personally negotiating a truce with Scotland, while Edward was away campaigning in France. The Queen was also a noted patron of the arts, particularly minstrels and musicians. Her influence helped shape the elegant, refined court culture for which she and Edward became renowned. Of course, the glamour and power couple dynamics of Edward and Philippa's marriage didn't preclude them from fulfilling the primary duty expected of any royal pair, producing heirs, and in this, they certainly rose to the occasion. Philippa bore a remarkable 12 children in total, including 5 sons who survived to adulthood. The eldest, Edward of Woodstock, would earn fame as the Black Prince and father the future King Richard II. Through Philippa's many daughters, the Plantagenet dynasty forged marital alliances across Europe. For all the splendor and intrigue that swirled around them, Edward and Philippa seem to have enjoyed a surprisingly stable and affectionate union by the standards of medieval royalty. Unlike his philandering father, Edward III never kept an official mistress. He relied on Philippa as a trusted political advisor and companion. According to some accounts, as the Queen lay on her deathbed, the grief-stricken Edward dutifully held her hand for several days until she passed. Even before Philippa's death in 1369, Edward began to withdraw from public life as he entered old age. The capable leader who embodied the chivalric ideal had grown increasingly infirm in both body and mind. During his final years, he fell under the influence of his grasping mistress, Alice Perrers, who purportedly plundered the royal treasuries. When Edward himself died in 1377, the once glorious Plantagenet dynasty he and Philippa had built teetered on the brink of chaos. Their great-grandson Richard II would prove ill-suited to the throne, eventually deposed by rebellious nobles. But despite the turmoil that followed, the legacies of Edward III and Queen Philippa endured. It was Edward who first established English as the official language of his royal court, a shift away from the French that had long been favoured by the Norman elite. He also founded the prestigious Order of the Garter, still the world's oldest national order of knighthood. For her part, Philippa popularised the name Philippa itself in England, where it had been quite rare, but now took its place in the royal rolls. Even more than their tangible impacts, Edward and Philippa came to embody an ideal of enlightened monarchy, ruling with a mix of piety, chivalry, patronage, and power. In later centuries, when the Tudors and Stuarts looked back to forge an English identity, they often invoked Edward as a model king, a paragon of both warrior courage and courtly grace presiding over a flourishing medieval realm. That these images tend to gloss over the more complicated realities of Edward's reign attests to the lasting pull of Plantagenet legend. Regal power in the Middle Ages was so often a family affair, the fate of bloodlines and kingdoms bound together in a great generational chess match. For Edward III and Philippa, whatever personal affection they may have shared was always interwoven with hard-nosed political calculation. Their marriage joined England to Philippa's native county of Hainaut, creating a vital early alliance in the 100 Years' War to come. These same dynastic imperatives meant that royal children were often treated more as political game pieces than beloved family members. Even for an evidently doting mother like Philippa, her daughters were destined to be used as bargaining chips, their marriages auctioned off to the most promising bidder. Princesses were routinely packed off to distant lands, as young as 10 or 12, to cement an alliance or claim a throne. Such was the case for Edward and Philippa's second daughter, the Princess Isabella. At the age of just 13, Isabella was dispatched to Gascony to marry Edward's close ally, the Lord of Coucy. The young girl's lavish wedding in 1365 served as much a show of English wealth and power as a marriage ceremony. Poor Isabella's elaborate trousseau filled an entire ship, while her dowry of 4,000 marks required another vessel to transport. The Lord of Coucy was so impressed by this ostentatious display, he voluntarily became an English vassal on the spot. Marital statecraft aside, the sheer act of giving birth was a crucial role, indeed a risky duty, for any medieval queen. With minimal understanding of hygiene and medicine, childbed presented moral peril for even the most exalted woman. Doubtless, even Philippa, who enjoyed the era's most advanced obstetric care, felt a shiver of dread each time her belly swelled with child. Perhaps she whispered a prayer to St. Margaret, the patron saint of pregnant women, or clutched an amulet of precious stones believed to aid in delivery. Of course, as with so many aspects of medieval life, royal births were witnessed by many and imbued with great political significance. When her time drew near, Philippa would take her chamber, retiring with her ladies to await labour in a darkened room sealed tightly against evil humours. As soon as a new prince or princess issued forth, bells pealed and bonfires blazed to celebrate another successful act of dynastic continuity, and a beaming Edward would dispatch riders to spread news of his expanded brood to all corners of the realm. For royal and peasant alike, children were the keys to power, whether that meant an heir to carry on a royal lineage, or simply extra hands to work the land. But even the most illustrious bloodlines must someday end. Edward III outlived both his beloved queen and his eldest son, the famed Black Prince. He died a dribbling shell of his former self, the realm he'd once commanded, already slipping into discord. There's a certain poetic symmetry to the fact that Edward was ultimately succeeded by his young grandson, Richard II, who was himself deposed and probably murdered. In the end, even the mightiest medieval monarch was made of the same breakable flesh and blood as the lowliest serf. The royal crown was always a heavy burden to bear, even when lined with the softest ermine. Perhaps there's cold comfort to be found in that essential equality. Whatever our station in life, we all grow, strive, scheme, and hurt. We love and we lose. We play our role upon fortune's stage for a brief hour, and then are heard no more. Kings and peasants alike return to the same silent dust from whence we came. And yet, some royal sparkle still catches the eye across the ages. In the heraldic lions stitched on a mouldering banner, or the entwined initials illuminated in a book of hours. In the ghostly chivalry of a poem praising long-dead knights and ladies, the traces linger like the scent of incense in a draughty chapel, or the half-remembered remnants of a dream upon waking. A dream of caparisoned steeds prancing down a tilt yard, of minstrels' melodies echoing in a rushes-strewn hall, of a gentle queen dispensing alms to the poor with a gracious hand. The clamour and pageantry fades into night's blessed hush, while somewhere in the distant darkness, a monarchy endures. As the sun set over the medieval kingdom, the castle grew quiet and still. The day's labours complete, the monarch and their court retired to their private chambers to unwind and prepare for the night ahead. For royalty, even these intimate moments maintained an air of refinement and ritual. Servants would assist the king and queen in changing out of their finery and into their sleeping attire. Luxurious nightgowns and robes of fine linen or silk, perhaps trimmed with delicate lace or fur, were donned. A chambermaid would brush out the queen's long hair with slow, soothing strokes until it shone like spun gold in the flickering candlelight. The king might sit pensively by the fire, sipping a goblet of warm, spiced wine as a page removed his shoes. These private quarters were the ultimate sanctuary, where royalty could let their guard down, away from prying eyes. Here, in the innermost chambers, the trappings of wealth and status were more understated. Tapestries depicting serene gardens and religious scenes adorned the walls, while plush carpets cushioned the stone floors. The massive canopied bed was piled high with embroidered pillows and blankets, an inviting cocoon promising a restful night's sleep. Before retiring, the monarch might linger over private correspondence at their writing desk, or pore over state documents one last time. A confessor would arrive to hear the royal confession and offer a blessing. Finally, with a weary sigh, the king and queen would slide into bed and draw the heavy velvet curtains closed around them, shutting out the world. As sleep descended, one wonders what filled the dreams of these powerful rulers. Did they envision victories on the battlefield, grand castles rising from their kingdoms, their legacy stretching through the centuries? Or perhaps in sleep, they were simply ordinary men and women, rejoicing, grieving, hoping, and loving just like any other. Kings and paupers alike looked peaceful in slumber, the burdens and blessings of their lives temporarily forgotten. Though we often imagine royalty living in unimaginable splendor, in truth their lives were an inseparable blend of pageantry and privacy, responsibility and repose. To peer through the gates of a castle is to realize that within those thick stone walls, behind the crowns and gowns, beat hearts not so different from our own. The storied walls of England's Leeds Castle could tell such tales of royal humanity, for this moated manor hosted many medieval monarchs over the centuries. Built in 1119 by the Norman lord Robert de Crèvecoeur, Leeds passed into royal ownership under King Edward I in 1278. This Castle of Queens, Queen of Castles, as it was known, became a favourite retreat of Edward's queen, Eleanor of Castile. Eleanor was renowned for her beauty, intelligence, and fierce devotion to Edward. A Spanish princess, she wed the English prince at the tender age of 13 and stood loyally by his side as he ascended to the throne and fought wars in Wales and Scotland. Together, the royal couple had an impressive 16 children, securing the Plantagenet dynasty. Tragedy struck in 1290 when, travelling to join Edward on campaign, the 49-year-old Eleanor fell ill with a quartan fever. The king rushed to her bedside at the manor of Harby, but there was nothing to be done. As Edward cradled his beloved wife, Eleanor slipped away, leaving the king utterly bereft. "I loved her tenderly in her lifetime," Edward lamented. "I do not cease to love her now she is dead." In his all-consuming grief, the king erected 12 elaborate stone crosses at each place Eleanor's funeral procession stopped on its journey from Lincoln to London. The Eleanor crosses were Gothic masterpieces, soaring monuments to an extraordinary queen and an enduring royal love. Though only fragments remain today, these crosses stand as a testament to the beating heart inside the crown. For all their wealth and power, the royals of medieval times were not immune to the joys and sorrows that comprise mortal life. They too suffered losses and delighted in triumphs, experienced despair and found hope renewed. Next time you gaze upon a crumbling castle or weather-worn statue, remember the human stories, the laughter and the tears, woven into the very fabric of history. As we wander through the dreamscape of the past, we find connection with our royal predecessors, not in their crowns and castles, but in our common humanity. And so, we bid good night to the kings and queens of old, knowing we share one thing above all, the need for rest at the end of a long day. The candles gutter out, the castle sleeps, and history marches ever onward. Good night, dear viewer, and may your dreams be as sweet as a royal lullaby from long ago. As we delve deeper into the lives of royalty during the Middle Ages, it's worth exploring the unique lifestyle they led, one of immense privilege, but also of isolation and expectation. Kings and queens were seen as embodying the highest ideals of nobility, chivalry, and sanctity. They were meant to be exemplars of virtue, piety, and leadership for their subjects to admire and emulate. However, behind the castle walls, monarchs were often more human than the lofty image presented in the history books. They had desires, flaws, and personal struggles just like anyone else. Marriages were often arranged for political gain rather than love or compatibility. Kings were generally expected to take mistresses discreetly, a tacit reality of court life. Queens might turn a blind eye to such dalliances to maintain stability and dignity. The lack of privacy was another challenge for medieval royals. From the moment they awoke to their last waking hour, monarchs were constantly attended by a retinue of servants, courtiers, petitioners, and advisors. Every move was watched, every decision scrutinized. A ruler's time was rarely their own. They lived in service to their role and the realm. The pressure to project an image of strength, justice, wisdom, and largesse was unrelenting. Perhaps no ruler embodied these tensions more than the 12th century Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born the wealthy heiress to a vast duchy in France, Eleanor first married King Louis VII at age 15. Beautiful, strong-willed, and highly educated, she was more than a typical political pawn. Eleanor even joined Louis on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land, leading her own troops as an Amazonian figure. However, the pious Louis grew resentful of Eleanor's more worldly ways. After 15 years, their marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. But Eleanor's story was just beginning. Within weeks, she wed the young Count Henry Plantagenet, who shortly became King Henry II of England, once Louis's vassal and rival. Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. As Queen of England, Eleanor fashioned herself a cultivated, cunning player on the world's stage. She was the matriarch of the vast Plantagenet Empire, spanning England and much of France. Her court at Poitiers became a centre of courtly love, troubadour culture, and chivalry, the epitome of refined romance. For all her influence and intrigue, Eleanor spent 16 years under house arrest when she supported her sons in a revolt against Henry. Ever resilient, she re-emerged after Henry's death, ruling as regent in Richard's absence. Eleanor's long, tumultuous life showcases the fine line medieval queens had to walk. Though constrained by their gender and role, the most brilliant found ways to carve out agency and influence. They were politicians, patronesses, diplomats, and dynasts, shaping the course of kingdoms, even as they navigated the prescribed boundaries of courtly behaviour. The great Angevin family discord also points to the precarity of even the most powerful royal houses. The privilege of birth was no guarantee of an easy life. Monarchs were beholden to many, to the nobility and gentry whose support they required, to the religious authorities who conferred legitimacy, to the common people who could revolt if pushed too far. Balancing all these interests while trying to impose their own will was a tightrope act. Perhaps that is what makes the royalty of the Middle Ages so enduringly fascinating. These were flawed individuals, shouldering the weighty expectations of their bloodline and station. We can trace the grand arcs of history through their lives, their triumphs and failures, their loves and losses. But we can also find glimmers of more recognizable humanity. Parents trying to raise children, couples navigating the complicated dance of arranged intimacy, leaders striving to wield power while keeping their souls. In the final assessment, the royal life was as much of a gilded cage as a pedestal. The lavish trappings of monarchy came with hidden thorns. Every sumptuous feast was underlaid by the spectre of poisoning. Each glorious military campaign risked capture or death far from home. The beautiful ceremonies and rituals masked a life of constant performance. Even a king or queen's bedchamber afforded little true privacy or escape from their duties. So while the pageantry and power of royalty exerts an eternal allure, we might also spare a thought for the human beings beneath the crowns, trapped in the machinations and intrigues that the hands of history had dealt them. Their exalted positions did not inure them from tragedy, heartbreak, or the knowledge that their personal legacies would be the stuff of chronicle and memory for centuries to come. It was a rarefied existence, privileged beyond measure, but also binding and burdensome in its way. As we conclude our journey through the lush, dramatic, but also surprisingly human annals of medieval royalty, one might feel both a sense of distance from and kinship with these storied sovereigns of old. The world they inhabited was in many ways impossibly different from our own, steeped in strange traditions and striking inequities. And yet, when we look past the ermine-trimmed robes and jeweled crowns, we find familiar struggles, hopes, and imperfections. In the end, perhaps that is the most enduring lesson the royals of the Middle Ages can impart from across the centuries, that no matter how high one's station or dire one's circumstances, we all share a common humanity that binds us together. Kings and commoners alike are but players on the great stage of history, each with roles to fulfill before yielding to the next generation in the unending cycle of birth, ambition, striving, and decline that is the mortal condition. So as we drift off to dream of chivalrous knights and resplendent queens in their towering castles and soaring cathedrals, let us carry with us a kernel of empathy for these impossibly distant and yet strikingly relatable figures. For in the final accounting, we are all united by the same fears and foibles, the same yearning to love and be remembered, to forge meaning and connection in our brief turn upon this earth. And with that, my dear friends, we come to the end of our reverie. If this visit to the realms of medieval royalty has proven a pleasant diversion, perhaps you would do this humble chronicler the kindness of sharing this tale with other curious souls in search of a bedtime yarn. Your interest is the most treasured coin in our storytelling coffers. Until we meet again on some other narrative shore, I bid you the very warmest of goodbyes, and may your own dreams be as sweet as a minstrel's lullaby echoing through the peaceful night air. Fare thee well,